right, well, here we are in an asynchronous fashion, talking about chapters 3, 4, and 5. So chapters 3, 4, and 5 are all about, hold on, I'm having technical difficulties here too. All right, they're all about, there we go, primary sources of federal tax law, okay? And so what we have is we have primary sources of federal tax law and we have secondary sources of federal tax law. We'll talk about secondary sources in a bit, but the important thing to remember is that primary sources of federal tax law can be cited for research purposes, okay? So, Chapter 3 is all about statutory sources, and remember that statutory means of the law, okay? Chapter 4 covers administrative sources, okay? And then Chapter 5 covers judicial sources. Now, what is kind of the interesting thing about the development of each of these sources? The statutory sources come from Congress, all right? The administrative sources, all right, come from the Treasury Department, and in some cases, directly from the IRS, all right? And the judicial sources, as you might have already guessed, come from the courts, okay? I think of the three, probably the judicial sources are the most problematic for students, all right? So tax treaties, all right? Tax treaties are probably one of the least familiar to students sources of tax law, all right? Their primary purpose is to eliminate double taxation. That's not double taxation like we would find from a corporate tax perspective. That's double taxation amongst countries. So if you're a U.S. resident, a citizen, and you're living in Switzerland, for example, we have a tax treaty with Switzerland that kind of outlines who gets to tax you on your income, what income items are taxed under Swiss law, and what income items are taxed under U.S. law. Okay, that's the purpose of a tax treaty. Okay, an important item to know about tax treaties is they have equal weight as the Internal Revenue Code, and they can conflict with the Internal Revenue Code. When they conflict with the Internal Revenue Code, the most recent one prevails, okay? So if you see a conflict between the two, you have to look at the one that's most recent, and that's the one that wins. All right, the legislative process, the reason this is in here is to help us remember why sometimes it takes so long for tax laws to be enacted. All tax laws start with the House Ways and Means Committee, and then they have to go through the process in the House, and then a kind of a parallel bill will then be put through the Senate, and then those two bills meet here at the joint conference, and they try to iron out the differences between those two before it gets voted on by the House and the Senate. All right, so it's a lengthy process, which can be very frustrating. One of the things that is important to know is that at each step along the way, there is a committee report. All right? These committee reports are published and they explain the rationale behind the code. So these committee reports are primary sources. All right, and when we go through and talk about our tax research databases, we'll locate committee reports because they can be very, very interesting and very useful when you're looking at different portions of the code. All right, so what we have here on this slide is an excerpt from the Internal Revenue Code. And the reason we have this excerpt is because one of the things that we have to get comfortable with in this class is learning how to cite the code and the regs in court cases, okay? And so probably from your earlier tax classes, you're very comfortable with seeing code sections written this way, okay? And so if we were going to cite that circled portion in a document, we could quite literally just write IRC section 121A and then continue on with our verbiage, okay? But what we need to know is what each of these things stand for, all right? So this number right here, that number 121, hold on one second. All right, so 121 is the code section, okay? Then we've got this lowercase letter, all right? In this situation where I circled in green, that's a B. So this lowercase b, all right, that is the subsection, all right? And then you have these numbers, all right? And so I've circled that 1. So in this situation, that 1 equals the paragraph, all right? And then we have to come down here and then we've got this capital letter, all right? That capital A is the subparagraph. And then beyond that capital A is this little I, and that is the clause, okay? So if we were going to be talking to someone and we were talking about this particular portion of the code, we would say Internal Revenue Code section 121, subsection B, paragraph 2, subparagraph A, the first clause, states that, and then you would continue, okay? So it's very important that you know what each of those letters and numbers stands for when we're talking about citing the code, okay? All right, so that is the end of chapter 3. Now we get to talk about chapter 4. Okay. All right. So chapter 4 talks about administrative sources of tax law. So if we want to talk about kind of the order of precedence, I'm not really thrilled with that green. I'm going to change colors. So if we want to talk about the order of precedence for kind of the most commonly cited primary tax sources, all right? So the Internal Revenue Code is first, okay? Then what would we have next? We would have Treasury regulations, all right? So Treasury regulations are an administrative source. So let's talk about Chapter 4, and then we'll roll into Chapter 5, and then at the end, I'll kind of wrap up with a discussion, kind of a larger discussion of the order of precedence, because I think that will be very useful. All right, so here we go. Administrative sources of tax law. What do we have? Well, we have a variety of things. So remember that the IRS is really a division of the U.S. Treasury Department, okay? So what that does then is gives the Secretary of the Treasury the ability to prescribe rules and regulations for the Internal Revenue Code and the IRS, okay? So the IRS issues these pronouncements, but the IRS does not write all of these pronouncements, okay? So the regulations are promulgated by Secretary of Treasury, okay? The letter rulings are absolutely promulgated by the IRS, and we'll talk about different types of letter rulings, all right? And then you've got these revenue rulings and revenue procedures, and they are also promulgated by the IRS, but they're sometimes based on court cases, okay? So that puts them in a slightly different category. All right, so regulations. Regulations are the official interpretation of the Internal Revenue Code, okay? They're issued as Treasury decisions. There are 3 types of regulations, and these regulations, all 3 types, what they're designed to do is explain the Internal Revenue Code. Lots of times they contain examples. They contain a lot more detail. There are sometimes 20 or 30 regulations related to one particular section of the tax code, okay? I'm going to slide this up a little bit and change the size. Now, there are 3 basic types of, or categories, I guess I should say, of regulations, okay? There are proposed, final, and temporary, all right? And really the big ticket items for these: proposed, do not have the weight of law, okay? So as you can imagine, you can't cite a proposed regulation. All right, because it hasn't been officially enacted yet, okay? But if you are talking with a client and they are asking you questions about a particular scenario, and you know there is a proposed regulation that impacts that situation, then you should absolutely tell your client about that proposed regulation, and you could then cite it in a memo to the client when you're talking about options. But it, at this point, if it's only proposed, it does not have the weight of law. Okay? Now, final regulations come in two varieties. There are general and there are legislative. Okay? So general regulations are not as precedential as legislative. All right? So legislative final regulations, all right, we'll put a little asterisk by this one, because that of all of the regulations has the most power, if you will. Okay? All right? And then that brings us down to temporary regulations, and they're exactly what they sound like. They're issued typically in response to some change in the tax code. Oops. Let's see if I can make that a little bigger. All right. Okay, they're designed, so they're issued in response to an act of Congress or a change in the tax code. They are designed to provide immediate guidance. Okay, they have the same force as a final regulation unless they are superseded. So they have the weight of law until they are superseded. Okay? Okay, they can be withdrawn. And they can expire if not finalized. Okay? And they'll expire if they're not finalized within 3 years. Okay? So you could have a temporary regulation on the books for 3 years, and it would have the weight of law for those 3 years. And then if it's not finalized, it's going to expire. Okay? Now, it's important to know how to cite these things and to know what their citation means. So I'm going to switch colors, okay? And so what you may see is them written as Treasury regulation. You may see them as Treas Reg, or you may see them as just Reg, okay? I am fine with just Reg, okay? And then what are you going to see? Well, then you're going to see the little section symbol, all right, and then a number followed by a period. Okay, and so you may see something like that. What do each one of these numbers mean? All right, well, let's go through that because that's important to know. Because that's going to tell you a lot about this particular regulation. All right, this first number, all right, that tells you the type of regulation. All right, and there are some common ones. One, for example, is income tax. All right, we see that one a lot. 20 is estate tax. 25 is gift tax. 31 is employment tax. All right. So that first number is very important from a citation perspective. All right. This second set of numbers right there tells us the Internal Revenue Code section that it deals with. So just by looking at this regulation, I know that it's a Treasury regulation. I know that it deals with income tax. And in particular, I know that it deals with Internal Revenue Code Section 162. Now, because I've dealt with a tax code a lot, I happen to know that Internal Revenue Code 162 is related to business deductions, okay? Business expense deductions, all right? So that's the Internal Revenue Code section. Then this next number tells us that that is the regulation number, all right? So by seeing that, we can say that there are at least 10 regulations related to Internal Revenue Code 162, okay? Now, I should say that not every code section has a regulation, okay? So not every code section has a Treasury regulation related to it, but some code sections have many Treasury regulations related to them, and a lot of times it just has to do with how complicated the code section is, how frequently that code section is applicable, if you will. As you can imagine, what qualifies as a business deduction is a big ticket item, so there's a lot of explaining to do with that. Okay, so that's just the regulation number. Doesn't have anything to do with what the code section number is. Okay, and then the last thing that we have in this citation is this T, and that T tells us it's temporary. Okay, if there was a P, that would be proposed. If it's a final reg, then it doesn't have a letter there, okay? So that's how you can tell just by looking at the regulation whether it's temporary, proposed, or final, okay? All right, let's talk about revenue rulings very quickly. All right, revenue rulings can be really, really useful to tax professionals because they give us an idea of how the IRS is going to treat a given taxpayer transaction. These are typically transactionally related. Lots of times they come out as a result of a court case, okay? They have a very similar, or I guess a standard structure, I should say. So their structure starts with an issue, all right? And then you'll see the facts that are related to it. And then they will do a whole discussion of the law and analysis. and then the discussion of the holdings. And so it sounds a lot like the structure of a court case, because lots of times they generate from court cases, and so they're structured very similarly. Okay? Again, we have to be very concerned with how we cite these things. All right? So there are two kinds of citations that you might see. There is a temporary citation, all right, and it's going to look like this. All right, and you can abbreviate revenue ruling to rev rule, okay? Okay, so that is the temporary format, okay? And so there are, again, lots of numbers, and each of these numbers mean different things. So, so this is the year, okay? This is the number of the ruling in the year. So this is the 5th ruling that year, okay? This is the weekly issue of the IRB, all right? And this is the page number where the ruling begins. Okay, now, what is the IRB? The IRB is the Internal Revenue Bulletin. Okay, now, you may think that these citation formats look kind of archaic. Well, they are kind of archaic because we have maintained the same citation format going forward back from when these were quite literally published in huge books. So if you watch old movies, for sure, and by old I mean even like, 90s, 80s movies, and early 2000s movies even, or if even in your accounting firms, the tax department still may have a huge tax library, and within that library will be copies of the Internal Revenue Bulletin with paper copies, quite literally, of revenue rulings in court cases in huge volumes, because that's how things used to be organized. So the citation format is a holdover from when we had volumes and volumes of beautifully bound copies of these things. All right, so that was a temporary citation. So now let's talk about a permanent citation. Okay, so a permanent citation is a little bit simpler. And again, you can abbreviate revenue ruling to rev rule. Okay, and that is what you're going to see from a permanent citation perspective. So let's talk about what each of these items mean. Okay, again, that's going to tell you the year. Okay, this is going to tell you the number of ruling for that year. Okay, and this is going to, this year tells you the year of the volume of the cumulative bulletin. Okay, so, and I left out one little piece that would be helpful. There could be a -2 there, okay? And so what this tells you is that it's the 1996 volume 2 of the cumulative bulletin, and it starts, and the ruling starts on page 6. Okay? Now, back in the day, you needed this entire citation in order to be able to find your revenue ruling, because you wanted, you know, the 58th revenue ruling in the year 1996, but you had to know which volume to go to in your big library in order to find it. Nowadays, you don't. Now we have these electronic tax databases, and so you don't need this whole citation, this whole permanent citation, in order to find your revenue ruling. All you need now is this portion. Okay, you need to know that it's the 58th revenue ruling issued in 1996. So for our purposes, if you want to shorten your citation to just this portion that's circled in green, that is just fine, okay? Because the whole reason you cite all of these things in a research document is so that someone can go back and verify that your sources say what you say they say. And so now all you need is the year and the revenue ruling number in order to be able to find that in an electronic database. So it saves us a little bit of space and time as we're documenting things. All right. Revenue procedures are a little bit different than a revenue ruling, and from a research perspective, not as useful as a revenue ruling for our purposes. What they tell us is kind of processes that the IRS is going to use. Okay, now sometimes that can be very useful because it lets us know what the IRS's process is going to look like, but typically from an answering a client perspective, revenue rulings are much more helpful than revenue procedures. Their citations look very, very similar. So a revenue procedures citation is going to be abbreviated Rev Proc, and then you're going to have the year and the number of the ruling. Okay. Now, it's interesting. And when we, next class, when we go through RIA, and we'll talk more about that, we'll look at a couple of revenue procedures, because there are a couple of revenue procedures that are updated every year that are very helpful to us. So not necessarily from a tax research perspective per se, but we use them in our everyday lives from a tax perspective. So it's kind of neat to see where they come from. I think it's neat anyway. All right, that leads us to letter rulings, okay? There are lots of different forms of letter rulings, okay? Collectively, they're called written determinations, okay? These come directly from the IRS. All right? So this is a communication directly with the IRS, if you will, and they can be very, very useful to us because we can see how the IRS would treat a taxpayer in this situation. Now, it is important to know that letter rulings in and of themselves cannot be used as a primary source of tax law. It is very, very important to remember that. Okay, so you might ask yourself, well, A, why is that? And B, okay, so then why do we spend so much time talking about them? Well, a couple of things. First of all, a letter ruling tells you how the IRS treated that particular taxpayer. All right, letter rulings are written for a single tax entity, and they only apply to that tax entity. So if I was asking for a letter ruling for a corporation that I was working with, and that corporation was able to get some sort of an agreement from the IRS, it would only apply to that corporation. It's very important to remember that. Okay, now there are multiple forms of letter rulings. All right. Private letter ruling is important to us because this is what we're going to write. Okay, we're going to do an example of that. Our first big writing assignment is a private letter ruling. Okay, what is this? This is issued by the National IRS Office. Okay, and it's in response to a taxpayer's request okay? And I think one of the most important things to remember about a private letter ruling is the taxpayer or the representative of the taxpayer is asking for permission. So you would like to have a particular transaction dealt with in a certain way, and so you're asking for permission. Okay, so what does that mean? So that means this is dealing with open transactions, meaning the transaction has not happened yet. Okay, now that's different from a technical advice memorandum. Lots of times these things are called a TAM, okay? It's abbreviated that way. So this is related to a completed transaction, okay? So the private letter ruling was an open transaction, a transaction that hadn't happened yet. This TAM is related to a completed transaction, all right? And it's requested by an IRS agent during an audit, okay? So, requested by IRS during audit, all right? So again, a private letter ruling is requested by a taxpayer asking permission. A TAM is about something that's already happened, and an IRS agent is looking for some guidance during an audit. Okay? Determination letters it's a more general type of situation. Okay? These are issued by local IRS offices. Okay? So the previous two were national offices. This is issued by local IRS office. Okay, and again, it's a completed transaction. Okay, So that is kind of the down and dirty on letter rulings. Next class, we'll look up a couple of letter rulings and we'll talk specifically about how they can be useful to us, because they can be very, very useful to us, even though we can't cite them as a primary resource. Okay, now we also have to know and be able to recognize a citation for a letter ruling, and their citations are going to look like this. Hold on, I'm going to change my pen just a little bit there. All right. Okay. Okay, so these first 4 digits are the year, all right? These next 2 digits are the week of the year, all right? And the last 3 digits is the ruling number in the week. Okay, so that is what all of those numbers mean. Okay. We also have a variety of other IRS pronouncements, and we are not going to talk about all of these, but it's important to know there are just a ton of IRS pronouncements. Okay. Of all of these, this is the one that we really need to look at, okay? And it's one that we haven't talked about before. We've talked about revenue rulings and revenue procedures. We talked about treasury decisions, tax treaties, all of those things. But acquiescences and non-acquiescences are something we need to pay attention to, all right? So the IRS will issue these, okay? And what it means is it's going to let you know whether or not the IRS is going to continue to fight a court ruling. Okay, so if we have an acquiescence, all right, an acquiescence means okay, so if you see the IRS issuing an acquiescence, or you may see at the end of a court case, the IRS acquiesces, all right? What that means is they just got beat in court. It's probably an issue that has been litigated frequently, and for whatever reason, they disagree, but they have decided that they are no longer going to fight in court that issue. So if you have a client that has a similar issue and you see that the IRS has acquiesced, the odds of the IRS wanting to litigate that are much, much less. Okay? Now, contrast that with a non-acquiescence. All right? So if the IRS issues a non-acquiescence, it means the IRS will continue to litigate. All right? So it means yeah, we lost this case. All right. The tax court or the district court or the Court of Appeals ruled against the IRS, but the IRS has decided that it is a big enough or important enough issue to the IRS that they are going to continue to fight that issue. So if your client has an issue similar and the IRS has issued a non-acquiescence, roll up your sleeves and get ready, because you may be headed to tax court if the IRS really wants to go down that road. Okay, so the difference between an acquiescence and a non-acquiescence is very, very important from a client service and a client strategy perspective. Okay. All right. There are a variety of other IRS pronouncements. Okay. And they can all be very, very useful and contain a good deal of information. It is important to know that these are not considered primary sources for the purpose of citing in a research document. Okay? Cannot cite these in a research document. Okay? Can't do it. All right? All right. Announcements and notices. Typically, they concern items of general importance to taxpayers. Okay. If they are redoing the individual tax forms, they'll make an announcement and publish a notice that the tax form is getting redesigned. Okay. So those are important to pay attention to. All right. Miscellaneous publications. You've probably run across those already. There are publications regarding moving expenses. There are publications regarding charitable contributions, all kinds of miscellaneous pubs. Okay. They can be very, very useful, but you cannot cite them. Okay. They are considered secondary sources for research purposes. And the reason for that is, specifically with miscellaneous publications, is they're written not by they're written by an IRS employee. Okay? And if there is an error, then the IRS very plainly states at the back end of all of their publications, they are not responsible for errors. So if there's an error, then they are not responsible for that. So they are not a primary source. They are a secondary source. So you cannot cite them for research purposes. All right, that leads us to Chapter 5. Chapter 5 is all about judicial sources of tax law. So let's talk about the federal court system, okay? So we have this fantastic federal court system, okay? And it's important to kind of know how it's all arranged, all right? And this diagram is in your book, and it's really fantastic because what does it show? Well, it shows the Supreme Court here, and as you might imagine, the Supreme Court is the highest court in the land from a criminal perspective, but also from a tax perspective, okay? So of the court system, this is going to have the highest precedent, all right? And then you have these two courts here, okay? Your Federal Circuit Court of Appeals and your U.S. Court of Appeals. Those are your appellate level courts, okay? And they are kind of your second tier of courts, all right? And then you have your trial courts, okay? and these are your third tier. Okay, so from a precedence perspective, 1 would be the best, right? 2 would be second best. 3 would be the last in line from a judicial precedent perspective. Okay? All right, who can use the federal court system? Both the taxpayers and the IRS can request that their situation be taken to court. Okay? So, don't think that it's just the IRS that can go to court. Okay? Federal court cases are the third primary source of tax law. They are very, very useful. Okay? Head notes and briefs. Next class period, as we start going through RIA and we start looking at court cases, you'll get a good feel for the purpose between the purpose of a head note and a brief. A head note, some cases have them, not all do, unfortunately. They give you a really good summary of the case. Okay? And typically there is one head note per issue that's addressed in the case. So if you have multiple issues in the case, then you may have multiple head notes. Okay? A brief is kind of what it sounds like. It is a summarization of the court decision, typically 1 page. It'll have a citation, which is helpful. And then the issues that were addressed and the facts and the holding and the analysis, very similar format as a revenue ruling. Okay? So who has the burden of proof? Typically, the taxpayer has the burden of proof. Okay? And there are some situations in which that changes, but typically the taxpayer has the burden of proof. Okay? Does confidentiality or privilege, like attorneys have, translate to the tax world? Not completely. Okay? Privilege generally does not apply to tax return preparation or giving accounting or business advice. Okay? So we do not have complete privilege when we're talking about confidentiality. All right? So let's talk about the tax court. Tax court is really cool because the tax court only hears federal tax cases. All right? 19 judges. Cases are usually heard by 1 judge. It is a national court. There is no jury. Okay? Now, the best thing for most taxpayers about tax court is you don't have to pay the disputed amount before you go to trial. Okay? So that can be really, really helpful from a financial perspective, right? Okay? What else do we need to talk about with the tax court? We need to talk about the Golson rule, okay? The Golson rule is very, very important to us from a tax research perspective because what it says is if there are conflicting precedents in different circuits, all right, then you only have to follow the one in the taxpayer's jurisdiction, all right? The U.S. tax court only has to follow in the taxpayer's jurisdiction. So what the heck does that mean? Well, I am an Illinois resident, all right? And most of y'all probably live in Missouri, okay? Illinois and Missouri are in 2 different circuits, okay? So if a court rules one way in Illinois and then rules a different way in Missouri, if I am going to tax court in Illinois, the tax court only has to pay attention to the ruling in Illinois, not the ruling in Missouri. Okay? So that can be very, very helpful to me. All right, there is a small claims division, and it is for tax deficiencies of less than $50,000. Okay? For those small claims division decisions, there is no appeal opportunity. okay? And these small claims divisions are issued as summary opinions, okay? These summary opinions cannot be cited. All right, so that's important to remember as well. So as you can see, there are lots of nuances with tax research, okay? Now, how do you cite a tax court case? Okay, well, you're going to see the case name, and then you're going to see a group of numbers, and then T period C, and then some more numbers, okay? This case name should always be italicized, excuse me, okay? This 131 is the volume number, okay? That is the page number, and this is the year of decision, okay? All right, now we get into the district courts, all right? Guess how many districts there are? Well, there are actually 13 districts, so for all you Hunger Games fans, there are 12 geographical districts, and then the 13th district is, as you might imagine, Washington, D.C. All right, so the interesting thing about the district courts is they hear all kinds of cases. Not just tax cases, okay? So their jurisdiction is the whole U.S. code, not just the tax code, all right? The judges are generalists. Case is typically heard before one judge, okay? And you can have a jury trial here, so that could be helpful if it is an emotional type situation, okay? Here is a big difference between district courts and the tax court. The taxpayer must pay whatever the tax deficiency is before trial, and then essentially you're suing for a refund. Okay? Now, how the heck do you cite these? Again, you'll have a case name. And that'll be italicized. Okay, so the citations get rather long, and there are different formats for these citations. So one of the things that I have posted on our Canvas site is, I believe in the modules. I'm going on and looking right now as I'm talking to y'all. In the modules section, there is a section called Course Reference Documents, okay? And there are several different documents, and one of them is Citing Court Decisions. And so you can go in that document and see several different formats on how to cite things. This is a great general format, and we'll talk more about citations and formats next class, all right? So this 103 right here is the volume number, okay? This AFTR is American Federal Tax Reporter. It's the name of what used to be a big set of volumes, all right? Now everything is located electronically, of course, okay? That is the page number, year of decision, okay? And then this is District Court, DC, okay? All right, so that's courts. The U.S. Federal Court of Claims is also a trial level court, okay? It is not a jury trial court. It only deals with monetary claims against the U.S. government, okay? Taxpayer must pay the deficiency and then sue for a refund, okay? Now, this court has a little bit of a different precedent, and we can talk about that more tomorrow because this is getting to be a lengthy discussion, okay? And then, so how would you cite this? Or not tomorrow, next class. The case name again is italicized. All right, so let's go on to the next one. All right, so the U.S. Court of Appeals. So this is your first shot at an appeals. Of course, the Supreme Court could be potentially your second shot at appeals, okay? Listens to both tax and non-tax issues, not a jury trial, okay? Again, there are 13 courts of appeals, 13 districts. And then what precedents must this follow? It must follow the Supreme Court, all right, and the circuit court from the taxpayer's circuit. Okay. And then let's look at a citation really quick. Sorry, my dog is absolutely going nuts. Grover, go sit down, man. All right, so we've got a case name. And it should be italicized again, okay? And then you're going to have all right, so in this citation, what do we have? Well, it's very similar to the others. volume, year of decision, page number, and then this is a court of appeals, okay? So what does the CA-9? CA does not stand for California. This is Court of Appeals, 9th District, okay? All right, this is a map with all of the different geographic boundaries of the circuit courts of appeal, okay? So that's kind of cool to look at, all right? A couple of things to note. Note that District 9, okay, is California, and 2 has New York, all right? Just remember that, and we'll talk about that here in just a second. All right, so the Supreme Court, jurisdiction, what do we know? We know that it hears all kinds of cases, a few tax cases, okay? Only hears cases in D.C. There are 9 justices. All justices hear all cases. They're appointed by the president, confirmed by the Senate. They serve for life, essentially, okay? This is not a jury court. They are typically, there are very few tax cases heard by the Supreme Court. And when it hears a case, typically it hears cases that are a result of conflicts among circuits or a very major issue, okay? Now, how do you get your case in front of the Supreme Court? You have to apply for a writ of certiorari. Let me write that down. A writ of I think I spelled that properly. Okay. And essentially, if they grant this, if the Supreme Court grants cert, then they agree to hear the case. If they don't grant cert, then they won't hear the case. All right. Now, if they don't grant certiorari, that doesn't mean they didn't agree with you. It just means they're not going to hear your case, so you have no more appeals, and your case will stand as it is. Okay. So granting certiorari simply means that they recognize that this is a tax case of great enough importance for them to spend their time listening to it. Okay? When you're looking at a citation, how can you see that it would be a Supreme Court case? Well, again, they all start with an italicized case name. Then you're going to have a volume number. Then you're going to have a federal tax reporter. Then you're going to have a decision year and a starting page number. And then for the Supreme Court, you're going to see United States Supreme Court. Okay? So, let's briefly discuss tax source hierarchy. And we will talk about this again next class and probably every class thereafter. Okay? So when you are citing tax sources, all right, you have to cite the Internal Revenue Code first. Okay? Okay? So that gets cited first. What happens next? Well, if there is a Treasury reg related, then you're going to cite that Treasury regulation. Okay? If there's a Supreme Court ruling, you're going to cite that. If there's an appeals court ruling, you're going to cite that. Okay? So that's a pretty strict hierarchy, 1 through 4. Okay? Now it gets a little funky. Okay? So here, even with the appeals court, we have to make sure that we clarify in taxpayer circuit, okay? And then I'm going to write these kind of equally because it kind of depends. So then next is kind of appeals court, not in circuit. And then we have okay. So all right, so what does this mean? So at the very top is always the Internal Revenue Code. Then the associated Treasury regulation, if there is one that goes with that Internal Revenue Code. If there is a Supreme Court case, then you're going to cite that next. If there is an appeals court case from the taxpayer's circuit, that would get cited next. Then an appeals court case not in the circuit, followed by district court, tax court, revenue ruling. Those kind of all have the same level of precedence, okay? So those are gonna, which would you put first is gonna be situationally dependent. How recent is the case? How closely does it align with your facts? There are all kinds of variables there that determine that. Okay, but I think it's important to talk about this hierarchy right from the get-go because we're going to be playing around with that and dealing with that next class. All right, that is all I have for this video. I will post this and post some other stuff for you too. Have a great night, folks.